So you think the path to Formula 1 is pretty straightforward to follow, karting to Formula 4 to Formula 3 to Formula 2 and then Formula 1. No, it's not as simple as that. So that's why today I will be explaining I'll go through and explain every junior racing series on the ladder to F1, including the costs of each one. So starting off at the beginning, it's karting. The vast majority of single-seater drivers start off in karting, which can range from the ages of 4 to... I don't know, any age realistically. Most professional drivers will have started by around 10 or 11 years old though. There have been some exceptions though, where professional drivers started karting quite late in the past. Takuma Sato started at 19, Adrian Suttle started at 14, Nicholas Latifi started at 13, and current Formula E driver, Jake Hughes, started at 16. So if you're good enough and rich enough, then you can start at any age, but being younger certainly helps. Kids will start karting typically as a hobby at first, before then taking it more seriously and competing at a local level. After that, they'll step up to national level and then international levels. Top drivers will aim to compete in the WSK and CIK FIA championships, as that is usually where all the top talent competes in. The karts get faster as the kids get older, transition from a direct drive kart to a manual gearbox one. Now the cost of karting is tricky to determine, as it can vary massively. Now it goes for all levels of motorsport, where the cost of it can really depend on how much you'll spend. So you can do it while spending less money, but you'll be significantly disadvantaged compared to the other competitors who are spending more. The drivers spending the most money will be racing for the top karting teams, who will have the best equipment and best engineers to help them, whilst others could just be the driver, family and their friends to help out. Kimi Antonelli raced for his family's team, Antonelli Motorsport, throughout his junior career, which is useful when it comes to costs. We've heard stories about how some drivers had to go fishing through bins for used tyres and had to race with broken parts, all due to their lack of funds. Karting at the beginning would roughly cost somewhere in a 4 to 5 figure region, but as drivers progress, the costs massively increase. Apparently the costs at the top level of karting are upwards of 200,000 euros for a season, which is just absurd. The top 3 usually in the top karting championships will be rewarded with a few super license points to help towards reaching their dream of Formula 1. You need a super license in order to race in Formula 1? Well, kind of. Mercedes did kind of bend the rules with Kimi Antonelli last year, and Red Bull are looking to do the same with Arvid Lemblatt this year. This license can be achieved by accumulating 40 super license points over the past 3 seasons. The next step up after karting is Formula 4, the first step in single seaters, but actually that isn't entirely true. Many British drivers actually take part in Ginetta Juniors, a sports car championship, for a year or two in their latter years of karting and early single seaters career to help them get to grips with racing post karting in a relatively low cost championship costing under 100 grand. Notable alumni from this series include Lando Norris, Jamie Chadwick, Louis Foster, Luke Browning, Zach O'Sullivan, Abby Pulling and Devlin DiFrancesco. There is also Formula Ford, an early racing series where drivers compete in single-seaters with basically just no rear or front wing. However, this is now slowly dying out as you see very few drivers now take this path. Before I start talking about Formula 4, I just want to talk about some of the fundamental basics of single-seater racing. Drivers will have to pay to race in every single category. This can be easier to manage for drivers that come from much wealthier families, but even families that the average person would consider rich would struggle to fund their child's racing career. Sponsors though can really help fund a driver's season. Drivers that are part of an F1 junior team will usually receive financial support from the F1 team, but they won't fully fund a drive at a team. This also means that drivers have to pay for testing. Sometimes you see the drivers that are struggling for funds will skip the post-season tests to save funds for the following season. The drivers not struggling for funds usually do a lot of testing to give them the best chance at being competitive in that championship. All these racing series will be spec series, meaning all the drivers will be racing the same car and the same machinery. Whilst that is true, that is also not true. These championships being called spec series makes it sound like everyone has an equal and fair chance at winning. That is far, far from the truth. The best teams in a championship will be able to set up the car the best and have the best strategy to approach racers each weekend. That doesn't sound like a lot, but trust me, it really is. Historically, Premier Racing has always been one of the best teams, if not the best, at junior level, and the weekend format is kind of similar throughout each level, but they do all have some differences. Mostly, each championship will hold a practice session on the Friday, followed by a qualifying session later that day. Then the weekend will usually consist of a reverse grid sprint race. They don't typically reverse the whole grid. It's usually something like the top 10 or 12 reversed from qualifying, meaning the driver who qualified 12th will be in pole, and pole position will start 12th, and so on. This will be a reduced distance race with reduced points available. Championships will hold 1 or 2 of these per weekend. This is accompanied by a main feature race, a race where the grid starts from where they qualified in a full distance race with full points available. Pit stops are mostly not mandatory. But anyway, back to Formula 4. Drivers will make the move up to single-seaters after karting when they're usually around 14 to 16 years old. Not all drivers though will have done karting when they reach F4 level. Arthur Leclerc had to pause his karting career at some point in his junior career so that the Leclerc family could prioritise their funds on his older brother Charles' career. He resumed his racing career though at 17 years old when he started single-seaters in French F4. Bruno Senna apparently never competed in any karting races and just jumped straight into Formula BMW UK. Vitaly Petrov began racing Ladas in Russia before moving to single-seaters in Europe. Gilles Villeneuve started in drag racing before getting bored and started racing cars around circuits. And Alessio De Leda switched from motorcycles to F4 at 22 years old, similar to Damon Hill. Anyway, the drivers will have a plethora of national FIA-sanctioned F4 championships to choose to compete in. The top one where everyone wants to go and win is Italian F4, which will typically cost the most at around €400,000 for a full-time seat there, which is far more expensive than it used to be 16 years ago at €90,000 apparently. Do note that these are rough figures I have found from various sources on the internet, so do take them with a pinch of salt. I did ask Prema Racing for how much a year of Formula 4 will cost me, but they are yet to come back to me, which could be down to perhaps my lack of racing ability, but I think it's probably down to not having enough subscribers for their liking. So I will kindly ask if everyone can please subscribe to my channel so that I can get this 2026 Prema seat. Best competition is in Europe and is where the majority of drivers aim to race. So the other top F4 championships are Spanish F4 and British F4, which both cost around €350,000. French F4 is also a great underrated championship for drivers as it is capped at €145,000 for a season. Typically, most drivers will compete in the national F4 championship of the country they live in, partly because they'll be used to the tracks they've seen all their lives, but also due to it just being cheaper for them. There are other strong alternate F4 championships in Europe, such as GB4, similar to British F4, just with a slightly different car and cheaper costs ranging from £120,000 to £150,000. Euro 4, a new championship with just 3 rounds, aimed to provide Italian F4 drivers and teams more opportunities after ADAC F4 was folded. And F1 Academy, which is a championship most of you will be familiar with. It's a woman-only F4 series which caps the costs at €100,000 for a season. After these championships, you have the cheapest FIA-sanctioned Formula 4 championships in Europe with Nordic and Czech F4, which cost under €100,000. But outside of Europe, there are still many solid F4 level championships. In Asia, there's Chinese, Saudi Arabian, Indian, Southeast Asian and Japanese F4, with the latter kinda serving as a feeder series towards Super Formula, but I'll get into that later. There's also Australian F4 over in Oceania too. I wasn't able to find an estimated cost of these championships, but I'd be pretty certain they aren't anywhere near the costs of the top European series. Over in the Americas, there's Brazilian, North and Central American and US F4, with the latter the only one I could find the costs of being between $130,000 and $195,000. There's also the USA's own feeder series system called the Road to Indy, but I'll get onto that later in the video. F4 calendars run like the other usual racing ones from around early spring to late autumn-ish. But during the off-season, there are F4 championships that take place in typically Asia and Oceania due to the weather not turning the tracks into ice rinks during those winter months. These championships are the Formula Trophy UAE, F4 Middle East and Formula Winter Series. Drivers will often take part in these partly due to their boredom over the off-season, but also partly due to the super license points on offer in these championships. In general, there's no limit as to how many cars a team in F4 can run. Some teams will run up to 6, whereas some will just run the single car. With most F4 championships, the winner gets 12 super license points, 10 for second, 7 for third and so on. Only difference is F1 Academy grants slightly fewer points. Drivers will usually race in Formula 4 for 2 seasons on average, depending on how well they do, to get to grips with single-seaters before making the next move up to Formula Regional. Yes, it is a bit complicated how Formula 3 isn't exactly the next step up, but trust me, this is a lot easier to understand than it was 10 to 15 years ago. Formula Regional Championships are held across a continent instead of nationally in F4. Again, there's generally no limit on the number of cars a team is allowed to run, so this can range from 1 to 6 cars per team. The top FIA-sanctioned Formula Regional Championship everyone wants to compete in is the Formula Regional European Championship by Alpine, or FRECA for short. It has produced top champions in recent years such as Dino Beganovic, Kimi Antonelli and Rafael Camara. The price of competing in this championship varies, as you could pay as little as €300,000 or as much as €1,000,000 for a season. Paying the most money will get you a seat at the best team, Prema Racing, who've won 5 out of their last 6 teams championships. So if you're not with them, well, you're a little screwed, aren't you? There are other FIA-sanctioned Formula Regional Series across the world in Japan, India, Australia and Americas. These won't cost as much as FRECA, but of course will set you back a lot. The Formula Regional Americas Championship is often overlooked, despite it has produced many great champions in Kyle Kirkwood, Linus Lundqvist and Kiffin Simpson. There are other European Formula Regional Championships that use very similar cars in Euroformula, Eurocup 3 and GB3. Euroformula used to be much more popular, but now these days it can only attract 12 cars per race. Eurocup 3 is seen as a more affordable version of FRECA, as it is capped at roughly €450,000. GB3, formerly British F3, has a calendar half held in Britain and the other half across races in Europe, and is a very competitive championship that many top drivers are now aiming to compete in. It's particularly popular with British drivers. Formula Regional hands out a nice amount of super license points to the top drivers at the end of the year. The winner gets 18, second 14, third 12 and so on. FRECA gets even more, with the winner receiving 25, second 20, third 15, fourth 10 and so on. GB3 gets much less though, with 10 going to the champion, 7 to second, 5 to third and so on. Like Formula 4, there are also winter championships held in countries that have opposing seasons to those in Europe. They hand out the usual super license points for other Formula Regional Championships, which makes it a very useful series to take part in over the winter. There's the Formula Regional Middle East Championship, which has seen Kimi Antonelli, Tuukka Tappinen and Evan Giltaire crowned as champions, proving that top drivers are all about this championship. There's also Formula Regional Oceania, which was dominated by Arvid Lindblad in the recent off-season. It was previously known as a Toyota Racing Series, which was pretty popular amongst drivers. It had been won by Lando Norris, Lance Stroll, Liam Lawson, Robert Schwartzman, Mitch Evans and Nick Cassidy. We also cannot forget about the new Formula Regional World Cup from 2024. The prestigious and historic Macau Grand Prix started using Formula Regional cars instead of Formula 3. A huge downgrade in my opinion. This is a massively prestigious one-off non-championship event held around the streets of Macau, where many drivers want to win during their junior career. The winner will be awarded 3 super license points for this accomplishment. Drivers on average will spend 2 seasons doing Formula Regional before moving on. It really varies how long a driver will spend in a racing category. For example, if a driver wins the championship in their first year or just does really well, then there's no need to hang around in that championship another year, so they'll make the move up to the next category, if they can afford it. But there's no rules stating how long a driver has to spend in a category or how well they have to do in order to move up. So it really is all down to how the driver feels at the end of the season. So anyway, the step up after Formula Regional is Formula 3. This one is much more straightforward to follow, as well, there's just Formula 3. Before it was officially launched in 2019, there were a plethora of different F3 series around Europe, but now there's just one where all the top and wealthiest racing drivers aim to get to in order to reach their Formula 1 dream. Every team in this championship runs 3 cars, meaning it's quite a large grid. Not all drivers competing in F3 will have done Formula Regional. In recent years, there's been many drivers that have actually made the jump straight from F4 to F3 with varying degrees of success. The likes of Arvid Lindblad and Ollie Behrman have done this very well, accomplishing 4th and 3rd respectively. I think it is important to note though that these two likely did have lots of testing to get to grips with the car, so it's not as big of a dive into the deep end, but still. On the other hand, there's been Roman Stanek, Pepe Marti, Jack Crawford, Nicholas Solov, Kasper Stuka and Ollie Gray, who all struggled and maybe even regretted moving up to Formula 3 that soon. The F3 calendar consists of the majority of races being held around Europe, with usually a round in Bahrain and now Australia. Importantly though, F3 is held on the same weekends as Formula 1, meaning they are a support race for F1. The cost of this championship is now very hefty. Joseph Loke, winner of the 2023 BRDC Award and racing Formula 3 in 2024, said on the Backstreet Drivers podcast that F3 is now around €1.5 million to race in, which is just insane. For comparison, Danny Kvyat apparently paid a whole €1 million less at $500k in 2013 for a season of GP3, a Formula 3 championship back in the day, which he won by the way, and went straight up to Formula 1 from that. The costs of racing are always increasing, making it even harder for the average family to afford to have a child chase this career path. The recent addition of Australia to the F3 calendar has made it more expensive, as these drivers will have to pay for flights and accommodation for themselves over there, as well as just the general costs of the car and everything for the weekend. The super license points available for F3 are very interesting. The champion receives 30, second gets 25, third gets 20 and so on. In fact, F3 gives you more super license points than in Formula E, which is genuinely insane. So quite a few drivers will actually have a super license by the time they've spent their time in F3, meaning that it is indeed possible for Formula 1 teams to sign them to race. Unfortunately, These days it'd be extremely unlikely that an F1 team would look to sign an F3 driver. Teams don't look at F3 drivers anymore being ready enough for Formula 1 and require them to take the next step up the ladder before jumping to the pinnacle of motorsport. F3 drivers that are part of F1 team's junior team rarely even get the chance to test F1 machinery whilst they are competing in that category. Only 3 current F3 drivers hold a super license, that being Rafael Camara, Tuukka Tappinen and James Wharton. The last driver to join the F1 grid directly from F3 was Lance Stroll in 2017, who'd come off the back of fairly winning the Formula 3 European Championship. It used to be fairly common to see drivers come straight from F3 to F1, as we saw Danny Kvyat, Carlos Sainz and Esteban Ocon all doing this. And the final step is Formula 2. Who would have guessed it? Like F3, there's just the one championship they have now since the FIA launched the new Formula 2 championship in 2017. This is the feeder series championship with the most eyes on it, whether that's from racing fans or racing teams looking at their next driver. This championship though does not come cheap at all. For a whole season, it will set you back between 2 million and 5 million euros roughly. So you'd think drivers paying that much money will surely be racing in an equal and fair championship. Wrong. That's far from reality. Drivers have complained about so many problems in this championship before. Firstly, the engine disparity is insane. Sometimes top drivers will struggle for large periods due to their car having a poor engine, which just kills their car performance and any hope of achieving anything. Then other times, you'll see a driver who, let's be real here, has had a pretty underwhelming junior career to date, then suddenly be at the front of the pack. I'm not going to name any names or give any examples here, but if you pay close attention, then you'll notice this quite obviously. The car reliability has also been pretty poor too, so poor that it's ended up costing drivers the championship due to something completely out of their control, despite paying millions a season for this. I could go on and on all day about the number of problems about this, but I'd rather keep this video under 4 hours long and the viewer retention to a decent level, so I'll move on. Every F2 team runs 2 cars each race, so the grid is actually one of the smaller ones at junior level. I previously mentioned how drivers will usually spend 1 or 2 seasons most in a racing category, sometimes 3 in rare occasions, but due to F2 being the height of junior racing, quite a few drivers will spend over 2 seasons in this championship, sometimes even more, to try and better their chances of finding a good seat one day in the world of racing. About 10 to 15 years ago, it wasn't that abnormal to spend over 2 years in F2, but now drivers aim to keep it to 2 seasons at most. Current F2 drivers Jack Crawford, Victor Martins, Kush Miney and Roman Stanek are in their 3rd seasons, whilst Amaury Cordial is in his 4th and Richard Verschoor is in his 5th. I mean, if you can afford it, then why not? But at one stage, these drivers should probably look at furthering their racing career. Formula 2 is the only junior series that requires a mandatory pit stop during the main feature race, and similar to F3, they race on Formula 1 weekends, meaning they follow the F1 circus around the globe. The super license points on show in this championship are very rewarding. The top 3 all get 40, the amount required for a super license, 4th gets 30, 5th gets 20, and so on. There are a few current F2 drivers that currently hold a super license. These are Arvid Lindblad, Dino Beganovic, Gabriele Mini, Victor Martins and Ritomo Miyata. The majority of F2 drivers would have joined the championship straight from F3, although there have been a few drivers recently who have gone straight from Formula Regional to F2. We've seen this successfully done by Andrea Kimi Antonelli and Joshua Dirksen, whilst it went disastrously for Gianluca Petikov, who raced 2 rounds before leaving due to financial reasons. So the next step up after F2 is of course F1, but it's not as simple as that. The motorsport industry being super competitive means that a lot of drivers at junior level won't even make it professional as a driver, let alone reach Formula 1. There are several career paths to take after F2. Some drivers will reach the F1 grid and start a career there. Some become test and reserve drivers, which usually just consists of them sitting on the sidelines watching the races. Others look to other racing series around the world. America has its own feeder series system for their top championship, IndyCar. This is also one of the best motorsport championships in the world, and is of course the series that holds the prestigious Indy 500. The ladder system is fairly straightforward to follow. The first step is either the Formula 4 US Championship or USF Juniors. The cars in these championships are pretty similar and the costs are too. In general, USF Juniors is apparently cheaper than USF 4, but they both are roughly around $150,000 for a season. USF Juniors is recognised on the road to Indy, which is very important. Every champion on each step of the road to Indy will receive a scholarship for the next step up on the ladder for the following season. Some of the USF Junior races are on the IndyCar Series support bill, giving drivers great exposure. The next step up from these championships is typically USF 2000. To translate, this is like a Formula Regional equivalent. To compete in a full season of USF 2000, it will set you back around $275,000. So after this, the next step up is USF Pro 2000. This will set you back around $300,000 apparently for a season, and this is their Formula 3 equivalent. This is the first step on the road to Indy that gives out super license points, with the winner getting a mere 10, second gets 7, third gets 5, and so on. So finally, the last step on the road to Indy is Indy Next, formerly known as Indy Lights. This is their Formula 2 equivalent and usually costs drivers around $800,000 to $1 million for a season of this. The super license points available in this championship are not great, as well, we know the FIA does not seem to rate America. The winner gets 15, second gets 12, third gets 10, and so on. What's great about Indy Next is that the champion receives a $1.4 million prize pot to go towards funding an IndyCar seat. Second and third also receive prize money with $125,000 and $65,000 respectively. Indy Next has produced some top IndyCar drivers in the past 15 years, with Joseph Newgarden, Pato O'Ward, and Kyle Kirkwood winning the Indy Next title, and all proving to be fantastic drivers in IndyCar. I do need to note that when I compare these series to their European counterpart, I mean it as in stepwise, not speed. For example, USF Pro 2000 cars are slower than F3 and Indy Next is slower than F2. In fact, performance-wise, Formula 2 are not that far away from the cars they use in IndyCar, with both of their chassis being produced by Dallara. The competition on the road to Indy isn't as fierce and competitive as it is in Europe, which is no shade to it at all. The top drivers are still obviously top talents with great skill. It's just, in my humble opinion, I would say the average driver on the Formula 2 grid is better than the average on the Indy Next grid. And that kind of shows, as IndyCar teams have in recent years been looking more towards the Formula 2 championship for drivers as opposed to their own Indy Next series. We've seen the likes of Christian Lundgaard, Marcus Armstrong, Callum Ilott and Santino Ferrucci all go directly from F2 to IndyCar in recent years, with Yuri Vips, Teo Porcher and Luca Giotto all making appearances in the championship too last year. Now let me talk a little about America's finest racing series, sorry NASCAR. IndyCar is somewhat of a spec series. They all use the same spec Dallara chassis, but the teams use different engines. They have the choice between a Honda or a Chevrolet V6. To compete in IndyCar, drivers don't even need to hold a super license. In fact, the IndyCar Championship itself hands out super license points to the top 10 in the standings. First gets 40, second gets 30, third gets 20, and so on. This is a low amount handed out than F2, which is an absolute shambles. Only 5 current IndyCar drivers hold an eligible super license, the same number as Formula 2 drivers. Like, how does this make sense? You may remember the controversy around Colton Herta not being allowed to join AlphaTauri for 2023 due to him simply just not having enough super license points, despite Herta being an established IndyCar driver by that point. Anyway, that's enough chat about IndyCar for now. Over in Japan, they also have a sort of racing ladder. They have a top racing series in Super Formula, which you may recognise as the series Red Bull have sent over their young drivers in recent years with Liam Lawson and Ayumu Iwasa. The ladder kind of starts with Japanese F4. This championship uses the same F4 regulated cars as the championships in Europe, with also the same F4 super license points available, with 12 for the champion, 10 for the runner-up, 7 for third, and so on. The next step up from this is Formula Regional Japan. This, as you can guess, also uses the same Formula Regional regulated cars as the ones in Europe. I wasn't able to find the costs for each of these championships, but I'd assume they'd be a fair amount cheaper than the competitive series in Europe. The next step up from this is Super Formula Lights. This is the highest level of feeder series in Japan and Asia, which kind of means it's like F2, but realistically the cars are more like F3 level. It usually costs drivers between 600 and 1 million euros for a season of Super Formula Lights, and interestingly, this championship offers fewer super license points than Formula Regional Japan. The champion receives 15 points, second gets 12, third gets 10, and so on. And then you have the top series with Super Formula. This championship is a very competitive and really good series to race in, but will apparently cost some drivers around 1 million euros to compete in for a season. The championship is a spec series with a chassis built by Dallara. These cars are actually faster than F2 cars and are much closer to Formula 1 cars, meaning it ranks above F2. This is why we saw Ollie Behrman do a Super Formula test at Suzuka at the end of last year to help learn the Suzuka circuit in a competitive car. Red Bull had a partnership with Super Formula team Team Mugen when they started reusing Honda engines. This partnership saw Red Bull send out their top drivers to compete in Japan to further develop their skill set. During this time, we saw Pierre Gasly, Dan Ticktum, Pato O'Ward, Yuri Vips, Liam Lawson and Ayumu Iwasa compete over there. The 2025 season sees former F2 and Williams Driver Academy member Zach O'Sullivan competing in Super Formula. There have been some big name champions previously in Super Formula, such as Ralf Schumacher, Pedro de la Rosa, Andre Lotterer and Nick Cassidy, but in general, most non-Asian drivers don't really go over to Super Formula to compete there. IndyCar, Formula E, WEC and F1 of course are all much more admirable championships to race in, so overall this is a great and underrated championship. Most of you will all be familiar with the name Formula E, the all-electric single-seater racing series. This is another top-level championship that races all over the world. Formula E doesn't quite have a direct feeder series to itself yet, but there's always talks and rumours of the series starting one. So maybe one day there's a slight possibility there could be an all-electric junior series. So this means that the teams there are often looking at F2 drivers these days to fill their seats. Over half of the current grid came to Formula E directly from F2, with the others either switching from F1 or sports cars. This series is often disrespected and labelled a championship where washed F1 drivers go, which is completely wrong and a huge disrespect. You don't get down-ticked in radio completions in F1. Formula E races around mostly street circuits, but have gone to permanent tracks in recent years in Misano and Portland. They hand out pretty decent super license points, although fewer than Formula 3, which is just outrageous. The champion receives 30, second gets 25, third gets 20, and so on. So to conclude this whole kind of flowchart thing I've got going here, the feeder series system is pretty complicated, but also pretty simple. I don't know how else to describe it. I haven't gone into the alternative routes as well in sports car racing, but do let me know in the comments if that is a video you'd like to see. I'd like to give a huge shout out to Goose is Cool, great name, who commented this video idea in one of my previous videos. So with all that being said, do subscribe, do leave a like and a comment, and I'll see you all later.